No one is going to be singing Country Roads on this night, unless, of course, it's some Baylor fans doing so sarcastically as the Baylor Bears defeat the West Virginia Mountaineers 45-20 and move West Virginia to 2-4 on the year. This is the WVU football postgame show here on Pittsburgh Sports Live and WV Sports Now. I'm your host, Mike Asti, and I'm going to be joined by Greg Carey of Metro News here in a moment. Mountaineers, as I said, lose 45-20, basically out of this game from Jump Street, and the sluggish starts for WVU in these games continue as once again, just like against Texas Tech, sluggish in that first half, tried to pick it up a little bit. We saw a little bit more of Garrett Greene in this game, including a late drive in this game, but it just didn't matter at all as West Virginia's defense could not handle the Baylor Bears, who are onward and upward in the Big 12. So whatever you think of them, a big win for that program over West Virginia and a bad loss for the Mountaineers. Greg, thanks for joining me on the show, man. Happy to have you here. What an interesting game to be talking to you on after that one here, as it at least moved quick for us. And I don't know if Neil Brown was supportive of that or not with holding some timeouts, maybe just wanted to get out of there. Because again, the Mountaineers did not really have a chance all the way through 45-20, the loss for WVU. Just right away, I mean, got a lot to unpack here from this game and even going on the rest of this season, because that's now going to be the commentary. We've already seen some former players kind of turn on the coaching staff, turn on some players on this team, talk about who they feel bad for and what should happen in the future. So we will discuss it too. But what are your thoughts now about this West Virginia team after this loss in comparison to maybe where you were prior to the game? Because this one has to sting just like Texas Tech did, coming off of a close loss to Oklahoma and then a big win over Virginia Tech. Neil Brown finally got that big win. And it's then since then been disappointing performances, to say the least.
Certainly, Mike. I think you would only really be reasonable to be a lot more discouraged from what you saw on really every side, or all facets, all sides of the ball from West Virginia today.
Right.
They had been very competitive in each of the three losses. And while I know the Mountaineer fan base wanted no part of a 2-3 start to the season, you flip a few plays, you can make a pretty sound argument that they should have been perhaps 4-1. Obviously, very largely competitive in the loss at Oklahoma. So I think when you look at not just another loss today, a seventh straight road loss, this is a team that has not won a road game now since before COVID. Last road with 2019, which at the time you kind of thought, a team that really nothing was expected of that year in Neil Brown's first season had overachieved to get to that point. They also kind of spoiled TCU's season, when the Horned Frogs had a chance to make a bowl. But 7 straight road losses the last 2 seasons, 3 to start this season, and this was far and away their worst performance of the season. I mean, you look at Baylor averaging over 8 yards of play and over 500 total yards of offense. We know about some of the issues that have plagued West Virginia's offense, and those were on display again today. But we certainly, I think, would have been fair to expect a far better performance from a defense that had been among the better defenses in college football to this point. Right. But it's certainly going to be taking a major dip in several statistical categories.
Yeah, and last year the defense kind of underrated as well after dealing with a scandal prior to the season and that inconsistency and lack of continuity. They started off last year as one of the better defenses in the country. In fact, ranked number 1 at one point. Didn't necessarily hold up, but a solid performance from the D. Obviously, you lose Darius Stills this year, but the defense had still been playing okay. And up until this point, it was the offense kind of letting them down. But as this season progresses, it now appears the defense isn't getting the job done either. And it's just collectively, it just really feels like we're getting slapped in the face that this team overall, as you put it, just isn't good enough and showing us it wasn't good enough. And as you mentioned from earlier in the year, you look at the Maryland game, 4 turnovers. Maryland's been kind of exposed, not nearly as good as some thought earlier in the year. They almost lost to Illinois. They're getting slapped around by the elite teams in the Big 12 or in the Big 10 now this year. And okay, you take away some turnovers. Maybe WVU beats Maryland. Maybe they should have won that game, even though Oklahoma's not as good as maybe their ranking and record shows. okay, you take that loss, but otherwise, maybe you're even feeling West Virginia could be a ranked team if you add the Maryland win instead of it being a loss at that point. And then that argument's obviously dead from what we've seen since then. What do you think occurred in this game, getting to this game? Now, West Virginia loses 45-20 to Baylor. Clearly disappointing. I think it is the worst performance of the season. The only argument that would exist, Greg, would be Texas Tech being the worst loss of the year just because they're a little bit of a worse team than Baylor is, and coming off of the prior 2 weeks, West Virginia is so bad in the first half. But either way, back-to-back weeks, these are the 2 worst losses. What went on in this game? Is it just Baylor is just too quick offensively and too much to handle for the defense? The defensive line didn't have a solid day. Was this just another bad performance from the WVU offense and Jarret Doege, even though the numbers don't show it being his worst outing of the year? Neil Brown's been criticized for some coaching decisions, including keeping those timeouts at the end of the first half. What the hell happened in this game? Because they never were in it at all.
Yeah, I mean, you look at 40 seconds or so into the game, a 75-yard touchdown pass is allowed. And while it was a good throw by Jerry Bohannon and kind of an electrifying play for the Bears to start, from my vantage point, it looked like there was a couple West Virginia players that were at least in position to make a tackle. Perhaps you give up a 12, 15, even 20-plus yard gain on the play, but you take a punch in the mouth like that off the bat. Now, they did answer with a touchdown drive of their own, but West Virginia has shown this year, not last week against Texas Tech, but they showed it against Oklahoma. They've shown it against Maryland. They do pretty well on the first scripted drives. You look at Leddie Brown, he took his first carry 80 yards in the Virginia Tech win. And they've had some success offensively on the first series of the game when they've been able to script things out, kind of get Jarret Doege into a rhythm and not been penalizing themselves, kind of shooting themselves in the foot. Haven't seen a lot of that on the first sequence. We've seen it throughout the games besides the opening series, but they answered the score and then immediately allowed another touchdown. I think it was kind of a combination of out-schemed, you could say. Baylor's offense, I know doing a lot of the research throughout this week, you expected the Bears to do the bulk of the damage on the ground. They only came into this game averaging 180 passing yards as a team. They throw for over 350 today, and that's doing very little passing in the fourth quarter with a sizable lead, obviously. So I think from that aspect, very concerning that, West Virginia's defensive line did not apply any sort of consistent pressure. And I think it would be fair to say coming into this game through 5 weeks, the defensive line had been the strength of the team. You look at Stills, you look at Akeem Messidor and Taj Alston. They had kind of formed what, could be regarded as a somewhat dominant trio up there, whether it was sacking opposing quarterbacks, disrupting them, or living in the backfield on running plays. And you didn't see any of that today. It was just so easy for Baylor. Guys running free against the Mountaineer secondary. Bohannon, I mean, you look at his numbers. He only completed 18 passes in the game. He throws for 336 yards.
Right.
He's up in the 17, 18 yards of completion range, which is pretty astounding when you start talking about the level that West Virginia's defense had played to this point.
Greg Carey joining me here on the WVU Postgame Show. Mountaineers losers 45-20 to the Baylor Bears. Greg Carey joining me here of Metro News. And speaking on Gary Bohannon, to paint the picture even with a swifter brush than you're painting it, of course, 18 for 29 in this game, 336. But overall this year, for any Mountaineer fans that don't necessarily keep tabs with Baylor, the first time all year he throws over 300 yards. In fact, his highest output prior to this game was 269 against Kansas. Of course, the worst team in the conference. You're looking at 13 for 27, 173 the week before, 164, 269, the 247, and 148 against Texas Tech. And we just saw West Virginia against Texas Tech the week earlier. So it's not like that's what he normally does. This Baylor offense, despite scoring basically at will against West Virginia's defense, did it differently than they've been doing it all year. And I don't know if maybe they saw something, and maybe they did. Maybe they're smarter than us. They're coaching, we're covering. We're out there scheming, saying, oh, they're going to do it on the ground. They don't throw that much. He's kind of a game manager. And they're saying, no, we can pick apart this Mountaineer secondary, and we're going to see almost 400 yards from our quarterback. Clearly, they're correct in their estimation, because that is what ended up going down. Now, obviously, the Mountaineer defense didn't have it in this game. and Baylor was able to march up and down the field, flipping the script, though, to West Virginia's offense, because prior to this game, the offense had kind of been the problem, and it still wasn't enough in this game. Jarret Doege, who has been WVU starter this year, and certainly made sense for him to start off the season as the starter, 20 for 31 in this game, 237, an average of 7.6 per, a touchdown, a pick, sacked 5 times. The O-line did not have a solid day, certainly hurting him. He's not nearly as mobile as Garrett Greene or really any others. But those lines aren't as bad as even some other outings. Those stats don't scream out at you. How would you evaluate Jarret Doege in this game in particular, even him all year? And then what do you think maybe is holding this offense back overall? Because when you have a returner like they do in Winston Wright, you have some talent with these receivers. Obviously, Leddie Brown, an All-American last year, feeling like that could be the case against this year. The whole offense, including these individual players, just feel like they're not yet able to fully explode this year. Why?
Yeah, and I think when you look at Jarret Doege's performance today, a bit of a mixed bag. He seems to start games. I know not last week against Texas Tech, but he has started games well. We've mentioned some of the success on, the scripted drives. But today, again, another costly turnover.
Yeah.
He does have a ball that was intercepted up around midfield. I believe it was 14-7 at that point. And like you mentioned, West Virginia's offensive line probably had its worst performance of the season today. I think that's pretty much goes without saying. You look at Baylor's sack totals, 6 sacks for Baylor, none for West Virginia. West Virginia loses almost 50 yards in those 6 sacks. And then again, another, pedestrian game for the running attack. Leddie Brown, who comes into the season, Mountaineer fan base kind of thinking he's probably among the elite running backs in college football. He's coming off a very successful 10-game season in 2020.
Yeah, reasonably so. I mean, reasonably so, right.
And when you look at his touchdown total this year, you'd say, okay, it maybe from that aspect of it, he has had a decent season in terms of his production. He's been able to score, but so many games, today, 44 yards. One game this season, he's gone over 100 yards. That was Virginia Tech, which we mentioned first play of the game. He ran for 80 yards. So pretty hard not to get to 100 when one play covers 80. But at this point, it almost seems unlikely that in a 12-game season, Leddie Brown is not going to get really all that close to 1,000 yards. I mean, he's barely over 400 now, and we're halfway through the season. So the production is certainly going to have to pick up. Now, it's a lot more than just Leddie Brown. Obviously, there's not a ton of running room there. West Virginia doesn't have a second running back that it relies on heavily. We saw some of Justin Johnson, a true freshman, today. And while he'll probably be a pretty big weapon down the line, right now you can't really say that. He struggled in pass protection on some scenarios. And I think that the lack of a running game is kind of hurting the passing game in a way. You look at the best passing is probably going to come off successful running plays, shot plays when maybe, like you just mentioned, the defense doesn't expect it coming, like we saw from Baylor today.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of plays that maybe Jarret Doege can hit slants with a better running attack. But
you could argue last year, aside from the Texas Tech game when he was actually playing well, and there were several games last year, Jarret Doege had great numbers. Maybe that was partly because Leddie Brown was killing it most of the year as well, and the offensive line holding more.
Certainly. And, West Virginia, I think they've got to get a little more creative sometimes in the running game too. I would like to maybe see not necessarily a running play, but, a trick play or two. I mean, change something up to try it. And I know at this point you say, well, you're playing 2 quarterbacks. Maybe you have no quarterbacks. Who do you rely on? But you're seeing virtually the same handoff that Leddie Brown receives, the traditional shotgun handoff where he's next to the quarterback every time.
Sure.
And I do think that there is some potential for him to find a little bit more running room and success on the outside. But by and large, when they go between the tackles and up the middle, it's, kind of 3 yards in a cloud of dust. First and 10 becomes 2nd and 7. And then oftentimes you're in 3rd down after that. So you've got to think that for West Virginia to get more comfortable as a passing team, the only real way to do it is to improve by running the ball, or to simply have, very short, quick passes that leave the quarterback's hands because the pass protection can't hold up long enough.
Yeah. And to, I guess, Neil Brown's defense here, because he's brought this up when this question has been asked by us all throughout the season, the way these games have unfolded, have not garnered the ability to kind of do what you're saying. You start off with all the turnovers against Maryland. You're down in some of these games early. You're down early in this game. At halftime, you're down by several touchdowns. It's very hard to be loyal to the ground game when you're down by several scores. So the defense hasn't helped out in recent weeks. Of course, you're looking at the Oklahoma game. That was very, very low scoring. They were in that game all the way through and still didn't really get Leddie Brown to get to emerge in that game either. And going even further into Leddie Brown's numbers, because we'll get to Jarret Doege here in a second, but Leddie Brown entering this season was the focal point. At the very minimal for him this year, this is hurting him individually in terms of pro potential, etc. These numbers are not going to impress anybody. They're really going to have to dissect some film depending on what they may think of him. Last year for Leddie Brown, you're looking at a running back who picked up, where am I? So he, on the ground, 945 in 9 games last year. Leddie Brown, 945 in 9 games, 378 entering this game, over 400 yards now, but 40-some yards in this game. Only the one game over 100, as you mentioned. That includes an 80-yarder against Virginia Tech. He's not nearly been good enough, but also handcuffed a little bit by the offensive line, etc. Maybe the defenses are scheming more against him. Maybe last year was more of a surprise, and the defenses this year said, we're not going to let Leddie Brown beat us. We're going to make Jarret Doege do it. And so far, that's been an issue. Greg Carey of Metro News joining me here on the West Virginia football postgame show on PSL and WV Sports Now. Head over to WV Sports Now for our postgame recap. And then, of course, stay here on this channel for any of our video reaction from this pretty bad loss for West Virginia. Now, it does require being more loyal to it. It does require the offensive line being better. It also requires the defense holding a little bit to allow these games to unfold that way to improve this running game. Right now, it's been a problem with Leddie Brown not able to do anything. But going back to the quarterback position, Craig, because this is going to be the conversation all week coming up now. This team is 2-4. This wasn't the worst performance from Jarret Doege, but it wasn't the best either. It also wasn't good enough. There's been a bad mistake in every one of these losses. You could argue Jarret Doege's maybe regressed a little bit even from last year, and it's harder on him with the offensive line playing worse and Leddie Brown playing worse than he did last year. We saw more from Garrett Greene in this game. Garrett Greene, 4 for 6, 5.8 per, 35 yards, though, ends up not able to show really what he can do as a potential passer, but once again, able to scramble a little bit, including 55 yards on the ground and a touchdown on 10 carries. We know he can run. We know he's versatile. Certainly a question mark as what he can do as a thrower. But is it time for you now at 2-4 to just go to Garrett Greene? And if that means that you only win a couple more games all year, at least you're preparing for next season and you're just done with Jarret Doege? Or would you rather still stay the course and try to crawl into a bowl game this year, since that's still viable, get another bowl victory like last year, and then go to Garrett Greene as then more of an unknown? What's your mindset now at this quarterback position, as this team's now 2-4, and certainly the quarterback spot has not improved enough?
Yeah, I would say you play who gives you the best opportunity to win at this point.
Okay.
I do still think that's Jarret Doege. If you think that Garrett Greene is a viable option to be your starter next year, which we don't really know.
We don't know.
Coaching staff feels that way. We don't know if Jarret Doege will be back again next season. And
that's true.
He could elect to return to school for another year if he wanted to. But I'm not sure, any bowl hope, I think, certainly would rest on having to beat TCU after the bye week. At this point, I don't see how West Virginia would have any chance to, make a bowl if they're not 3-4 at 2-5. They're going to have to go 1 down the stretch. They still play Texas, Oklahoma State, Iowa.
So if TCU is a loss, would that change your mind then?
Perhaps. I mean, and now the thing about that though is you've got 2 weeks of prep for that game. So if we're going to make a switch, it might make a little more sense to do it with the added preparation. But the counterpoint to that is, these coaches see these guys practice every day throughout the spring and the fall. And while they certainly aren't right in every decision they make, they thought it was pretty clear who the starting quarterback was, and that was Jarret Doege. They didn't have it as Garrett Greene, whether that be because they don't think he's as good of a passer, he doesn't understand the offense as much.
Could be. Yeah.
A couple things that Neil Brown's hinted in the press conferences to suggest that he didn't necessarily have a very crisp spring, and they weren't pleased with some of the things they saw from him there. So I think it's hard to just turn the keys over to him for 60 or 70 plays a game and say, get us to where we need to be going, because truthfully, we haven't really seen Garrett Greene have any success passing the ball yet.
Well, right. But that's the nail on the head for me. At the very minimal, because honestly, as much as I do still agree Jarret Doege would be giving you the best chance to win this year, and I certainly understand why he started this year as the quarterback for me, and of course, maybe he could elect to return. I don't know if for me, it would be as much about this season as well as preparing for next year at this point, because a bowl game is not in any way guaranteed, and you do need that TCU game to get it. But separate from all of that, we do have an unknown about Garrett Greene as a passer. This isn't Pat White. This isn't the spread offense. If he cannot throw the ball with some type of accuracy, and we've seen bombs in practice as well, but not necessarily accurate passes, then it doesn't matter. You got to have some ability to throw the ball in the Big 12 under the Neil Brown system. Would you at the very least like to see more in terms of plays, in terms of passing plays, and more of that in these games? We are still only seeing 3 or 4 passes per game from him. They're 2 or 3 yard dumpers, and then a lot on the ground. Obviously, if he starts, that cannot be the offense with him. But maybe do you want to see more from him in these games, even if Jarret Doege still gets 45 plays and is your starter?
I think one area you can make a sound argument that you should and could see more of him is when West Virginia gets in the red zone. They've far too often had to settle for field goals this season. So change something up, try something different. I don't know if Garrett Greene's arm is going to be what solves some of the drive stalling in the red zone. Maybe it's his legs. Maybe it's just the threat that he's in there. Maybe Leddie Brown can find another opening because the defense has to kind of key in on the quarterback and respect his mobility. But when time and time again, you even saw it late in the first half today, 28-7, an opportunity to make it a 2-possession game. West Virginia has to settle for a field goal. They start the second half, 28-10. They come down and get in the red zone, 28-13. Those, when you're taking 5, 6, and 7 minutes off the clock, settling for 3 points on a day in particular when your defense is struggling so much, it makes it nearly impossible to catch up. And I think the lack of red zone success in recent weeks, we've seen short field goals against both Virginia Tech. We've seen short field goals against Oklahoma and Texas Tech last week. They've been critical, not necessarily today in the outcome, but they have been critical to this point. And it was, again, discouraging today to see them have to settle for 2 kicks inside the 20-yard line. So maybe try to change something up. Maybe throw Garrett Greene in, have him try to throw a pass to a tight end. I just
the unknown we would finally find out, right?
Whatever is taking place right now isn't working. And when the windows get tighter and some of those 5 and 10 yard slants that may be open early in the game or on a 3rd and 10 play where the defense might be relaxing a little bit and playing off somewhat, when it's down in the red zone, those windows are tighter. There's less space to run routes. There's smaller windows for quarterbacks to hit you. So they haven't had much success there. We've seen Doege miss some throws in the red zone. We've seen guys kind of struggle to make plays that maybe they could have made to help him. But regardless, when Leddie Brown's not rolling, when you're settling for those field goals, maybe it is time to look for a little bit more of a spark. And I know they have gone to Greene on occasion in the red zone, but maybe it's something where they can instill certain packages over the bye week and figure this would work pretty well, or it's at least worth giving a look.
Not only for me is it about preparing for next season, likely not with Jarret Doege as the starter, but that's a great point that you made as well. At the very least, you can sprinkle in Garrett Greene more into the offense. You can see if he can throw the football, because honestly, I think the doomsday scenario, Greg, is to end this year, regardless, even if it somehow crawls into a bowl game, where Neil Brown, the coaching staff, the fan base, and media do not know still if Garrett Greene can throw passes, legitimate passes in games. That's going to be then a problem for next season, because then you're trying to figure it out in camp, which that may not honestly tell you if he can do it in games either. That's still camp. They're not coming full speed like they normally would be in a game. If you're looking at a 6-win season as your ceiling, really, and crawling into a mediocre bowl game, even lesser than last year, that would be nice. You want to win bowl games than not. It does a lot for the program outside of just getting you a victory in a postseason win. I do get all of that. And Neil Brown wants to stack bowl game wins rather than missing a bowl appearance. But at the end of the day, you also got to prepare for next year. You got to see what Greene has. You got to see it. And in the red zone, if Jarret Doege is missing in the red zone, I think a lot of the fans honestly would feel this way. And it'd be interesting to find out. If West Virginia fails in the red zone with Garrett Greene, it feels to me like some of the fan base would feel better about that than failing with Jarret Doege, because at least you're trying. It wouldn't be worse than the situation currently. And West Virginia, correct me if I'm wrong here, this is just quick trying to tabulate this in my head. I believe only 2 touchdowns in the second half against FBS opponents all year, including one in this game. Outscored 17-10 overall in the second half of this game, much closer, but of course 21-7 after the first quarter made it impossible. And that means the 2 touchdowns in the second half, excluding the LIU game, where of course the offense clicked. Now, West Virginia wasn't good enough, of course, getting blown out by Baylor 45-20. West Virginia coming off 3 straight losses since the big win over Virginia Tech, the biggest win of Neil Brown's career as WVU head coach, really of his career in general, to say the least, but it's been rough since then. And there are people, there are fans, there are now former players being vocal on social media that weren't prior to this week. I'm well aware that Neil Brown has the support of the athletic program. Media has voiced liking him. I will agree. He's been a great guy. He's been friendly to media. A lot of former players, when he got hired, told me, Mike Logan's one in particular, was very open by saying he felt much more welcome at the program with Neil Brown than maybe in the prior regime. Pat McAfee has brought that up. So that's a positive. Fans, media, everyone's kind of loved Neil Brown. He's said and done a lot of the right things. And last year did feel like a climb to get a bowl win after the cupboard was so bare the week earlier, the year earlier. But at this point now, you get into year 3, it's looking like not a bowl season. They're stacking some bad losses. They have a lot of key positions in doubt. Where are you in the trust of this climb with Neil Brown? And separately from that, just your opinion, where do you think the program is, and what would need to occur for him to have this seat heat up a little bit? Because of course he's going to be back next year. He's not going to be let go. Shane Lyons does support him. But if this season ends up going in the tubes, you have 3 years in, 1 bowl win, but then the climb feels like it's not going up. You're falling off the mountain. And now you have question marks at key positions. You're getting into a younger team. Will this seat heat up at some point, and what would have to happen to heat up this seat?
I think the seat's heating up. I don't think he's necessarily in trouble this year at all, and I don't think he really should be, because I'm a firm believer you should at least be able to bring in a recruiting class for every year that you've been there. So, while a lot of the guys who are making plays may be holdovers from the previous regime, we don't really know yet what some of the 2020, 2021 recruits may be capable of.
Top 20 recruiting class too, which is surprising at WVU.
And at the end of the day, this is a results-based system, obviously, and a results-based, we base everything off results. Losses are losses and wins are wins. But I think a few more performances like today only makes the seat much warmer. You start looking at West Virginia's schedule, very unlikely, in my opinion, that they'll be favored in a game again until their final one at Kansas. So whether they can steal a game or two before then, perhaps they can. Yes, we've seen things like that happen on the Big 12, and it's not inconceivable to think that perhaps they could beat a TCU or a Kansas State or, even an Oklahoma State at home. But when you look at potential to finish 3-9, maybe no better than 4-8, you start to look after today. Neil Brown is 8-15 overall, if you exclude FCS opponents, which there are 3 of, and Kansas, which you expect to beat FCS opponents in Kansas, regardless of who you're at. So you kind of think he's pretty much losing 2 out of every 3 games at this point that aren't against the likes of James Madison, Long Island, Eastern Kentucky last year, and then 2 wins over Kansas in 2019 and 2020. Plus, let's not forget they didn't play Oklahoma last year. Pretty good chance that would have been another loss on the resume.
Sure.
But you've got to have a little bit of patience. I know it is extremely frustrating. I know many Mountaineer fans, buddies of mine, people that live locally, people I talk to every day and every week that are very frustrated. I've season ticket holders, and they have a right to be frustrated. They have a reason to be frustrated, especially when you look at losses to teams like Maryland, Virginia, or I'm sorry, Texas Tech, and then laying an egg today. Let's kind of call that what it was. Whether they thought West Virginia would win today or not, I don't think anybody envisioned that the game wouldn't be competitive for the better part of 3 quarters.
That's the discouraging
part. And I think one of the biggest things about the Neil Brown era right now that has West Virginia fans so discouraged is the fact that he is more of an offensive mind. And this is a team that has quarterback issues. We knew they were going to have offensive line issues when he took over. That's an area that you've got to build depth on. They've got a little bit better depth. Well, in terms of the last 2 seasons, they're still not where they need to be. And Neil Brown would be the first to admit that. He said it many times in the preseason. But you kind of think that even offenses that don't have an NFL quarterback, close to an NFL receiver, whatever, there's a lot of teams in college football that can score 30 and 40 points pretty routinely. West Virginia hasn't done that this season. They've only gotten to 30 points 5 times under Neil Brown. 3 of those 5 times were one game against Kansas, the Long Island game this year, and Eastern Kentucky last year. So in legitimate football competition, they've scored 30 points twice. And that's not going to cut it. You can have a solid defense. You can have one of the better defenses in the Big 12 and college football until you develop a little bit more offensively and get more explosive, more long gains, more big plays, more trust in your quarterback. You're not going to show a whole lot of offensive improvement. And I think that's where a lot of the fan base rightfully has questioned whether it is worth it to trust the climb and how long are you trusting the climb? What does next season have to hold? Because there was supposed to be a pretty significant improvement, at least in terms of reaching a bowl game and probably winning more than 6 games this season among the fan base that was expected. That's not going to happen. I'd say now the best case scenario is 6-6, and that seems pretty far-fetched when you look at today.
Neil Brown has absolutely talked the talk. He has said all the right things. Last year ended the season with a tear-filled apology to West Virginia fans. A lot of people even said you don't even have to apologize. It's 2 years in. The cupboard was bare when you got there. They're looking at a bowl season and talking about the climb again. And it was a lot of people saying his first year at West Virginia was year 0. A lot of colleagues literally were saying on their shows and columns, that's year 0. Neil Brown was offered a lot of slack. And rightfully so. Again, that was the situation he was dealt with. Shane Lyons is in lockstep with him. Great career at Troy prior. It seemed like the right fit. It seemed like a situation where fans, media, former players, everybody really was excited about Neil Brown, felt he was the right fit, saying and doing all the right things. But eventually, you got to turn talking the talk into walking the walk. And 8-15 against legit competition, with your offense being that sluggish, with a quarterback position that is in doubt, when some called you the quarterback whisperer prior to getting WVU. I don't know what he's whispering, but it's not working out to this point. And just starting off so sluggish. And I also think a balloon was popped a little bit after the Virginia Tech game because, okay, finally had a big win, because some argued Neil Brown never had a big win over WVU. People downplayed the Kansas State win. You could say, okay, Maryland, that sucks, but turnovers killed that game. Okay, team's going somewhere. And then even the close loss to Oklahoma. But then to have him admit the team wasn't prepared to start the Texas Tech game, Jarret Doege saying the same thing, we weren't ready to go. That just seems insane to go off of the prior 2 weeks and basically admit you weren't ready, and then to see that again here. So you admit it, and then it's not fixed, and it's arguably worse. And the way these games have unfolded, as you're touching on, that's the key here. So it's how they're losing, how they're performing. The record overall at some point has to improve. And I do feel it's reasonable to expect this year to have been at minimum a bowl game, if not a better bowl game than last year. Maybe last year was a bit ahead of the climb because they did get a solid bowl performance with how weird last year was and not sure when you're going to play the games and losing a game in the schedule, et cetera, with a pandemic. But that felt like they were climbing last year and saying and doing all the right things. And this year does feel like a step back and not so much of a climb. And then next year is an inexperienced roster, a quarterback position that's in doubt. And yes, the excuses could fly next year that, okay, this isn't a roster that should get into a bowl game, but how long will that work for the fans and the alums, the media, etc.? Neil Brown's been given a lot of benefits of the doubt to this point, a lot of trust to this point, but the feeling around the program obviously isn't a good one when you have former players being very vocal on Twitter against you, fans jumping off the wagon. You're seeing a little bit more criticism now, even from media. And he's not going to deny any of this. He does take it on his shoulders and take the blame. But at some point, it is a results-based business. You need at least 3 years to put your team in there. But this is also college football in 2021, not in 1981. He is just simply not going to get the time that Don Nalen or Rich Rodriguez got. And I don't think he's obviously going to be under that hot seat now. He's going to be back next year. But I would imagine that if next year is like this year, even if it's a worse roster and less expectations should be there, at the very least, there would be a closed-door meeting where they would be said to Neil Brown, you're going to have to get in a bowl game the next year. We're going to have to part ways here. At some point, you do expect more out of the program. And Neil Brown's the first to say it. When he took the job, he talked about 15th winning his program. He knew what Don Nalen did. He's talking to him. He's welcoming former players back, wants to get the team back to glory. He said, give me time, etc., but it would eventually occur. I mean, we're going to go into year 4 next year feeling like you're going backwards. So that's definitely going to be a problem here. Greg, I definitely appreciate you joining me on the show. I just do want to pivot real quick with West Virginia's schedule here moving forward. Obviously, right now, 2-4, 45-20 losers to Baylor. But coming off of that loss, West Virginia will have the game against TCU on the road. That is after a bye. So maybe you're preparing a couple weeks with Garrett Greene. Maybe Jarret Doege is still your starter. Maybe you're going to sprinkle Garrett Greene in more. Regardless of what's going on at quarterback, but also a part of that, what are the keys to the game against TCU? What do they have to do to beat the Horned Frogs? And how much of a must-win game is that for how you plan the rest of the year? And if it is about the rest of the year, or if then that would pivot to where it really then would be about 2022.
Certainly. I'll be honest. I kind of thought today was pretty close to must-win mode for
so did I.
Being the early October game and one where you're trying to avoid going 0-3 in the conference. So, like I said, if you have any bowl aspirations, absolutely have to have a win at TCU. Can't see any way that West Virginia would make a bowl game, after starting 2-5. So that really is where the hope rests. But before you even look at TCU, it's got to be a week of self-reflection. I mean, this is a bye week. You've got 13 days between games. You've got a chance for, potential little nagging injuries here and there to get healed up. But everybody's got to kind of look in the mirror, and especially, even the defense after what you saw today, and think, what can I do to get better? Because before you improve yourself, you can't really worry about what Max Duggan and some of those guys on TCU, and the challenges they may present. And I think when West Virginia does return to action, maybe you see a little bit more creativity, a little bit crisper performance, perhaps coming off a bye week. I think you would at least hope for that. But after the discouragement of today, I don't know that that's realistic. You've got to go out and prove it. And this is a team that has really struggled on the road. It's going to be another road game. And I think one thing that will be interesting to see as you talk about moving ahead, it's kind of crossed my mind today when, the outcome was not in doubt. If West Virginia loses at TCU, what will the following week's attendance look like against Oklahoma State?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. These fans are replying to these players saying, I agree with you. Thanks for saying it. That's not looking good.
You look at a potentially 2-5 team welcoming what'll probably be a ranked team in Oklahoma State. Normally that's a game fans would be amped for, have it circled on the calendar. If West Virginia's 3-4 and still has a lot to play for, maybe that's the case. But if they're 2-5, that's a pretty hard sell for a team that would come in having lost 4 straight without a win in the Big 12. And you're looking at probably a crowd, I would think, well under 50,000 if that's the case.
Yeah, and then you're looking at 2-6. I mean, you're looking at not being favored in any of these games because TCU is maybe a game you'd be favored at home, but you're on the road. West Virginia struggled on the road, and then the rest of the year has a schedule that certainly could get tough, and then you have Kansas at the end, maybe the last time they'll be favored. Greg, I appreciate the time, man. It was a rough outing there for the West Virginia Mountaineers. They do lose it 45-20. I'll let you get back to enjoying the rest of your Saturday. It's been a wild ride in college football to this point. I did see what happened there at the end of the Red River shootout, as it was a shootout, to say the least, there between Oklahoma and Texas. And a lot more is certainly going to unfold the rest of this day around the college football scene. And unfortunately, on a national scope, the focus no longer really in Morgantown at this point, unless they can turn this thing around. But thanks for joining me. We'll definitely hope to have you back here on the show, Greg Carey of Metro News. Thanks
for having me.
Absolutely, man. So West Virginia, 45-20. Unless you say the Texas Tech loss was the worst of the year, I think this is the worst of the year. And maybe this is the worst because at least you finished strong against Tech and you feel like, okay, West Virginia started really sluggish against the Red Raiders. That sucks. That's unacceptable, even though Neil Brown and Jarret Doege admitted it. But it's not going to happen again. They played better in the second half. Jarret Doege even played better. They're going to turn it around. They admitted all week. We got the videos here in Pittsburgh Sports Live. We got to start faster. We're not going to be that sluggish again. We're confident in ourselves. We know we can't be that bad again to open up a game. Well, you were a little bit better, I guess, but the defense was worse, 21-7 after the first quarter. West Virginia did score a touchdown in the second half, but again, Baylor put up 17 points in the second half. So you lose the first half, you lose the second half. Once again, you can't put it together. And overall as a team, you didn't start out strong yet again. So West Virginia continues to befuddle a lot of fans and media. This is once again another disappointing loss for the Mountaineers. This is the third straight. It's another one in conference play, of course. It's another one to a team that many thought would be vulnerable and could be a beatable opponent prior to entering this season. And after the Virginia Tech game, which absolutely is the biggest win for Neil Brown as head coach of West Virginia, you could argue of his overall career because that's a renewal of a rivalry. That was a ranked team then, a top 15 team. That was a big win for West Virginia. They played okay against Oklahoma, not really great Oklahoma, a little bit overrated this year for me, kind of been exposed this year for me, even though they're still undefeated. They're still pulling these W's out. They're still a top 10 team and maybe could crawl in there into the playoffs, certainly. And right now, still the favorite to win the conference. But you got about the D- effort from Oklahoma, still couldn't beat them. Okay, that's Oklahoma. But then to start out sluggish against Texas Tech, lose that game against an average Tech team, lose to Baylor. The way you lose to Baylor, not just losing, but the way you lose to Baylor, as Greg mentioned, 2-4, going to a bye week. It's really, really rough because now for Neil Brown, it's going to be multiple weeks of the fans and media talking about how bad this team is, talking about the state of the program, having former players that are tweeting me for crying out loud about how they're no longer sold on Neil Brown. Who do you want at quarterback? I don't trust this anymore. I got to say it. I'm going to be open-minded, but I'm also going to speak my mind. I get it. It's hard to argue with any of them. And as Greg touched on, you go into Oklahoma State against Oklahoma State 2-5. If you don't win that game on the road against TCU, how are you going to be mad at any fans for not going to those games? How are you going to be upset at the fan base for not showing up and not selling out those games if you're 2-5, 2-6, 2-7 at the end of the year? And you're going from a bowl victory over a good Army team that had 9 wins entering the game against West Virginia, and people thinking, okay, they are climbing, even if the year earlier was so bad. The cover was bare then. They figured things out. They got the triplets of Jarret Doege, Leddie Brown, and some receivers. Well, they got more weaponry this year, an offensive line that's worth. Jarret Doege now playing worse. And Leddie Brown, to be fair, has been worse. Granted, handcuffed by the O-line. So you got 2 weeks now of fans, media, and former players that are going to just be complaining all over Twitter, all over social media. And if you don't come out strong against TCU, even on the road, which will be a tough place to play for the Mountaineers, how can you ask anybody to show up even at home against Oklahoma State or any of those teams, knowing you're just going to get beat down, knowing you don't have a shot, and knowing there's really nothing else to play for in the year? So Greg was a little nicer, danced around it. For me, I would pull the trigger right now. If you're going to pull the trigger, this is when to do it because it would give 2 weeks to Garrett Greene to fully prepare, to learn the offense, to figure out if he can throw during practice, at least give him more reps during practice. And at the very least, if he's not your starter on the road against the Horned Frogs, you got to see more than a few plays where they're just small passes for 2 or 3 yards and nothing's expected overall. And he's mostly a runner in the game, does have a touchdown run now again in this game. But you got to see if Garrett Greene can throw enough to be your starter, because if he can't, you have no chance as him being the starter. He's basically then just a gadget guy. And then you have to see if Jarret Doege can get better and if he's going to come back. And if not, who knows who's playing quarterback for West Virginia? There are recruits coming in, but for next year, absolutely a question mark. So at least get those questions answered, because for me, at 2-4, this is already about 2022 and preparing for 2022. But if you lose the TCU, as Greg said, it definitely is. TCU is by far a must-win. This game against Baylor was a must-win for me. Texas Tech was a must-win for me. They're both losses. They're both bad performances. TCU got to be better. 2 weeks to prepare. Neil Brown's going to take it. Jarret Doege's going to take it. Leddie Brown's going to take it. The defense is going to take it. I'm sure Dante Stills is going to take it. None of it matters. We know they're going to take the blame. It needs to improve. It needs to improve. They need to get better. They need to literally climb, not seemingly go backwards, because right now, I don't know how anyone can be asked to trust a climb as they're watching a team appear to fall backwards. And if they're on any type of mountain, fall off of that mountain, because that absolutely appears to be what is to come. Once again, thanks to Greg Carey joining me here off of Metro News, out of Metro News here on this post-game show. Bad for the Mountaineers yet again. So we have a negative post-game show this day here on our college football schedule in Pittsburgh Sports Live. Pitt, of course, off. So West Virginia is our show, and West Virginia is a loser. 45-20, the Mountaineers lose to Baylor, another conference loss, another bad loss. A lot of question marks. A lot needs to be better. A lot of criticism coming for Neil Brown and company, and 2 weeks to deal with it. So we will see now how the Neil Brown crew responds, because we've already been seeing to this point how they've been responding. That needs change. That needs to be better. And a big response needs to be there on the road against TCU after a bye week, or things could get really, really ugly around this program, and that seat could ignite for Neil Brown. The West Virginia Mountaineers lose it 45-20, completely picked apart by the Baylor Bears. A lot to discuss, a lot of question marks, and a lot needs improved heading into a bye week for the Mountaineers, and then a must-win game, as many people are already jumping off the bandwagon, no longer trusting the climb. And I'm talking fans, media, and former players. And now the West Virginia Mountaineers need to respond. So Neil Brown